A reading from the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 15, verses 1 through 3, and verses 11b through 32. Listen for a good word from the Lord. Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to Jesus to listen to him. And the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So he told them this parable. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me." So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout the country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out as one of the citizens of the country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough to spare? But here I am, dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him, and filled with compassion, he ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his slaves, 'Quickly, bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet, and get the fatted calf and kill it. And let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his elder son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. The slave replied, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf, because he has got him back safe and sound.' Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and begged him, pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you have never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him.' Then the father said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found.'" This is the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. Thanks be to God. We all have that one movie or show that we have to see many times as we can even. And each time we see it, no matter how many times we've seen it before, we pick up on something new, some nuance and theme or connection in the plot that we have never seen before. And it makes it feel like we are seeing it again for the first time. We are at least seeing it from a new perspective. Or maybe it's that book that we read over and over again, and each time we read it, there is a sense that the text is reading us anew again. We find ourselves in the story and its characters in different ways than we did the last time. Was that because the text has changed? Or we changed? Well, maybe it's a little bit of both. We get to the 15th chapter of the Gospel of Luke, and all one has to say is, there was a man who had 2 sons. And already you know where you're going, because you've read it and heard it before. And hopefully each time it has read you anew. There was a man with 2 sons. It's like the blast of the first chord played by the brass in the opening credits of any Star Wars movie. We hear it, and automatically we find ourselves eagerly entering the story. The characters and themes in this story are universal. There's the family in conflict. There's the desire to belong and to come home. There's the sense of desperation and need for help anywhere you can find it. There's the reconciliation of the Father and the Son that so many families desperately desire. There are themes of grace and forgiveness. It isn't a very long story, but it is so full and so good that some have called it the gospel within the gospel. Again, we have an image of God as an all-loving parent who wants nothing more than to bring his family together. It doesn't matter what it cost him. His family happiness is all he wants. Commenting on his mission to seek out and bring all people into God's family, Jesus says that it is as if the younger son came to the father and asked for his share of the inheritance. And that time, that inheritance would have likely been a portion of the family land, the property. The son is going to get this portion of land when the father passes away. But he already thinks of it as his. He's just skipping a few years ahead on the calendar. What's the big deal? But to ask for something like that, when the father was still alive and healthy, was an enormous insult in a culture built on honor and shame. It was as if he was saying, "Dad, I wish you were dead. At least at that point, I could take what was mine and live my life without you." At least that's likely how the father would have heard it. Perhaps it wasn't meant as an insult. Perhaps it was a younger son trying to just prove himself, make a name for himself, get out of the shadow of his father and his older brother. Perhaps this is a young man with an entrepreneurial streak. "Dad, I've got dreams, ideas, plans. If you give me my inheritance now, I promise it will be worth it for me and for you, for the entire family. Just think of it as an investment more than a gift. I promise it will be worth it. Just trust me." Maybe he just didn't know how hard it would be to actually strike out on his own and build something from scratch. Maybe the temptations to live the lavish life, keep up appearances, play the part were just too great. And maybe it prevented him from sticking to the plan. Well, whatever the motives of the younger son, the father, in that moment, does the unthinkable. He agrees to give his son what he asked for. He knows that his son has the free will and conscience to make his own mistakes, and he watches as he adds insult to injury by taking his part of the family estate that has been in the family for generations and selling it to someone else. He then takes the money, and he heads off to the city. And the father watches, broken-hearted and afraid, as the son packs his bags, hits the road for another place. All the while, the father praying as he watches him go, "God, look after him. Watch over him, protect him from harm, get a hold of him and guide him, call him back to himself, and if at all possible, please just bring him home." Countless parents have prayed that same prayer, even under the best of circumstances, as they watch their children go into the car and drive away, or as they hug them and watch them turn around and walk into the dorm room. The prayer becomes that much earnest, however, when a decision or a fight or a harsh word has torn them apart. With each step that the child takes, it feels to the father as though the chasm grows wider and deeper and more difficult to cross. It must be how God feels about any of us when we return God's love with rejection, in a sense that we can do it on our own. We can do it our own way. Now, it isn't mentioned, but I imagine each night after the day's work is done, after the dinner is complete, after the dishes are all put away, and after everyone has gone to bed, the father sits on the front porch, looking off into the distance as far as he can, squinting in the darkness, reliving that moment of watching his son walk away down the same road. And each night he prays again, "God, please look after him, watch over him, protect him from harm, get a hold of him and guide him, call him back to himself, and if at all possible, bring him home." The younger son thought he could make it on his own. He thought he knew better than the old man. He didn't need him. He was unstoppable until he wasn't. He came to town with lots of money. He could buy anything he wanted. But as soon as the money ran out, so did his options. And only when he finally hit rock bottom and woke up one morning with mud all over him and the stench of the pigs wafting through the air and the feeling of the rumbling of his stomach did he at last think about going home. Jesus said it was then, at that moment, the younger son came to himself. It's as if the younger son finally realized who he always was and that what he always needed was always within reach if he had simply known where to look and how to ask for it. He didn't have to prove himself to anyone. He didn't have to make a name for himself or produce something incredible. These things might have helped his own ego, but deep down, that wasn't what it was all about. He had tried it on his own and failed. But maybe that helped him realize what he had always known deep down. He didn't need to be anything more than what he was. He was his Father's child. He was loved. All his Father cared about was that he came home at the end of the day. So it is with each of us. We are God's beloved children. There is nothing we can do to change that. No matter what we have done, it does not change the fact that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, and we are loved. We are loved without limits. Having no other option, the younger son swallows his pride. Maybe, just maybe, his father will take him back as a servant. So he starts the long journey home, and the whole way he is rehearsing his apology speech. Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am not worthy to be called your son. Let me just be one of your servants. But he never gets to finish it. As soon as he sees him coming and recognizes his long-lost son, the father, who has been keeping vigil and praying for his son this entire time, again does something unthinkable. He gets up out of his chair and he runs as fast as he can to meet him on the road. Before the son can say a word, the father throws his arms around him and he falls on his neck. He covers his son's filth and shame with love and honor. He calls to the servants and says, bring him a robe and a ring and kill the fatted calf, because my son was dead, but he is now alive. He was lost, but he is found. We're going to have a party. We are going to welcome him back home. Christ is calling all people to remember that's how it is with God's love for us. It is as full and extravagant and undignified as a father who runs with abandon to welcome his child back home. We refer to this passage so often as the prodigal son, because it's the son who spends without limits. In reality, it's the father whose love is extravagant and plentiful and given freely without limits to children that could not possibly deserve it. It is always available, no matter what we have done. It is always calling us back to relationship. It is calling us back to a place where we can remember who we were created to be. All we have to do is start walking back home, and God moves towards us and meets us on that road. I once read that there is an old Jewish proverb that says that when God decided to create the world, God foresaw all of the sins that humans would ever do against God and against each other. And the only way that God could continue the work with what he had seen was to decide right then and there to forgive the world before God even created it. God knew we would fail and that we would reject God's love. And as disappointed as God may be with us at times, as heartbroken as God may be, that disappointment never outweighs God's love and forgiveness. It is given again and again, each time as if for the first time. There may be some of us that need to be reminded that God is like that Father who is ready to welcome us back home. We are ready to come. The words, I'm sorry, aren't even on our lips before God is wrapping us in loving embrace, dressing us with symbols of God's family and saying, I always loved you. All I wanted was for you to come home. Still, though, we can't forget about the other character in the parable. We can't forget about that older brother. He's the one who has been working the fields like a good, responsible son should. He's the one who has never turned his back on his family obligations. And he can't believe it when his father welcomes that good-for-nothing son of his back home. He was so busy working in the fields, he didn't even know there was a party going on. Only when he came home after a long, hard day did he realize that the celebration had begun without him. They didn't even bother to stop to call him to join the festivities. I mean, no wonder he's resentful. When the father is confronted by his older son, the father realizes his son has also forgotten himself. He's forgotten who he is, just like his younger brother. He somehow feels slighted, thinking that he has always had to work as hard as he could to earn his father's love and favor. But the Father has given him everything already. All he ever had to do was come back home at the end of the day, and his Father would have been happy and proud because this was his son. And that's how it is sometimes when love is given in lavish, limitless, undignified ways. We might fear that God only has so much love to give, and if God gives it to someone we feel doesn't deserve it, then like a son who is worried about losing a portion of his inheritance, we fear that somehow God won't have enough love for us. But it doesn't work like that with God's love. There are no limits to it. The more of those who come home to God, the more of God's love that goes out into the world. Remember why Jesus told this parable in the first place. The scribes and the Pharisees don't like what they see Jesus doing. He is hanging out with the wrong people in their eyes. He is engaging even in the intimate act of sitting with them and sharing a meal with tax collectors and sinners that the scribes and Pharisees would never have associated with. They would have considered those people to be unclean and profane. So Jesus told them 3 parables, actually, about his mission from God to seek out all of God's children and bring them home. And he'd already told them that he came for those who were sick and in need of a doctor, those who were lost and in need of a shepherd. The others, they weren't loved any less. They were just fine if they just remembered who they were supposed to be and came back to God as well. Join in the celebration. Join in the work. These others just needed particular attention at the time. There was enough of God's limitless love to go around. The older brother is angry, and perhaps understandably so to many of us. But there could also be more to it than just anger. Anger, after all, is often a manifestation of something much deeper. Maybe there were elements of grief here too. When the younger brother took his share and left, who had to console their father when his heart was broken? Who had to sit with him on the front porch at night and tell him that it was all going to be okay? Who had to work doubly hard to make up for the portion of the property that the younger brother had liquidated? It was the older brother. That's who. Even more still, today, it isn't beyond the realm of possibility to consider that the older brother's anger and resentment may have been the result of his own personal grief. It isn't beyond imagining that this older brother wants nothing more than to grab his younger sibling by the collar, stare him in the face, and make sure he understands that it isn't just their father that he ran out on. He abandoned his brother too. Today, I read this as a story about limitless love that reveals the potential for reconciliation for all people and all relationships. It is an invitation for all children of God to live into and reflect the limitless love revealed in our Heavenly Father, and to be reconciled, no matter what has been broken between us. I think that is why the father turns the conversation around to the older brother. Like the father, he needs to lean into forgiveness and reconciliation. This isn't just my son, he tells him. This is your brother. He was lost but is found. Time to reconcile and join the party. The reminder to the church today is that those who follow the way of Jesus are invited to join in the reconciling work of the Father of limitless, undignified love. It is a love that wants nothing more than to see people brought back together. While the church is seen by many in the world as resentful to anyone on the outside, if we are going to be about our Father's work, then we need to remember the reconciling love we are called to share, a love that brings all people together. As I heard someone say recently, God is more interested in relationships than riches, more concerned with community than canceling, and more interested in reconciliation than rebuke. And we must be too. In his book, God Has a Dream, Archbishop Desmond Tutu once wrote, "I have a dream," God says. "Please help me to realize it. It is a dream of a world whose ugliness and squalor and poverty, its war and hostility, its greed and harsh competitiveness, its alienation and disharmony are changed into their glorious counterparts, when there will be more laughter, joy, and peace, where there will be justice and goodness and compassion and love and caring and sharing. I have a dream that swords will be beaten into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks, and that my children will know that they are members of one family, the human family, God's family, my family." As we said last week, these stories hold up a mirror for us. Each time we come to them, they read us anew. So where are you today? Are you the wayward child desperately wanting to come home, wondering if you can? Are you the dutiful child, wondering if you can live in a world of God's grace for anyone and everyone? Are you the servants, ready to prepare the party the moment the master calls for it? Or are you out there running with abandon like a father into the world, doing everything you can to show the world that Christ is calling us all back to ourselves? Wherever you are, keep reading and finding yourself again. Come back to yourself. Come back to God's limitless love. Amen.